A very good morning to you all this morning, and a very warm welcome once again to our weekly look at Mark's Gospel on a Sunday morning, as we've been doing for the last few weeks. I think all the weeks that we have been locked down and we haven't been able to be to physically go to the church in the Bethel Bush in Clydach, we are meeting like this on a Sunday morning. I hope you are well, and I hope you've had a really good week, and my thanks to you again for joining me this morning and for listening in once again. We've been looking together over these last couple of weeks at the beginning of what we would call Holy Week, or the week of Easter, over these last couple of weeks. And last week we asked ourselves that difficult question, didn't we? What do we do as Christians when God does something that disappoints us, perhaps, or that when he goes a way that is different to the way that we would have gone? It happened as Jesus entered Jerusalem on that first Palm Sunday 2,000 years ago. The crowd were full of expectations that he would go and he would confront the Roman occupiers, but he didn't. He went another way, and he disappointed those who were waving palm leaves and were laying clothes before him. And we asked ourselves the question, well, what do we do when God does something that's different to what we would have him to do, or what we would have done if we were in charge ourselves? And from looking at Mark's Gospel, we saw that the answer to that question is to follow him. When Jesus does something different to the way that we would have done something, then the answer is to follow him and allow him to lead. We saw last week that's an awful lot easier to say than it is to do sometimes, and it takes a lot of trust and faith and confidence in him. But that is his command to you and me as we are with him this morning, as we have another encounter with him, to follow him and allow him to lead from the front, with us following behind. That was last week's little look at Mark chapter 11, and so we're moving on from there this morning. And as promised, we're going to be spending our time looking at the story of Jesus cleansing the temple. So we're going to read together from Mark chapter 11, and I'm going to read just a few verses this morning from verse 15 down to verse 19. Mark 11 from verses 15 down to verse 19. And so verse 15 says this: So they came to Jerusalem, and then Jesus went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry wares to the temple. Then he taught, saying to them, Is it not written, My Father's house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations? But you have made it into a den of thieves. And the scribes and the chief priests heard it, and they sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his teaching. And when evening had come, he went out of the city. This week's passage then, going on from last week, as we continue to look at what Jesus did next after he entered into the city of Jerusalem. It's those verses from Mark's Gospel that I'd like us to concentrate on this morning, and to a story that is called by Christians the cleansing of the temple. It's a story that needs, I would think, a little bit of background, a little bit of understanding on our part, because it contains some things that we are not familiar with and are not part of our everyday life, because it contains the temple. And the temple is, I suppose, a difficult thing to understand as a non-Jew. And as a Christian, our understanding of what the temple is, or what the temple was, is a difficult thing sometimes to get our heads around. And as Christians, we are tempted to compare the temple in Jerusalem, the biblical temple in Jerusalem. We can be tempted to compare it with our modern church building. And that would be a mistake, because the two things are not comparable at all. The temple is nothing like the modern church building. In the situation that we are in, and we've been in over these last couple of months, this current pandemic has closed church buildings all over our country. It's closed our church building in Clydach Vale. It's closed churches all over the world. But it hasn't affected my relationship with God at all. Because that lovely white church that we attend up in the middle of Clydach Vale, when you think of it, there's nothing special about it at all. I'd love to be there this morning, as I'm sure so many of us would. I'd love to be there at 10:30 and have a cup of tea with you. And I'd love to have the service with you and enjoy fellowship with you this morning. But however much I would love to be there, I'm still able to worship where I am. I'm still able to know God where I am, still able to pray, still able to witness, still able to preach and to fellowship, just in different ways and in different places. And so the church building to a Christian in reality is nothing more than a convenient place to meet. There's nothing special about it. There's nothing holy about it. I'd love to be there this morning just for convenience and to meet up with you all again. But there's nothing particularly special about a building and nothing holy about it. That's the church building. Now the temple that Mark talks about here in Mark chapter 11, well, that's a completely different story altogether. Now, and I must admit to you this morning that I'm not an expert in Judaism or in the Jewish faith, but reading from the Old Testament, we can say that the temple is a special place, a different type of place, certainly not the same as a church building would be this morning. As we read the Old Testament, we read through the Bible, that much is obvious. And it's true to say this morning that all of the relationship that God had with Israel was based around the temple. Worship would happen there, and prayer would happen there. Sacrifice would happen there. Laws would be established there. And perhaps the most important thing of all, God's presence would be encountered there in a way that it could not be encountered anywhere else in all of the world. So special, so different, so holy was this place called the temple. God's presence would be encountered there in a unique way, in a way that it couldn't be anywhere else in the world. The temple contained a place called the Holy of Holies, and it was a unique place where the presence and the glory of God would dwell on earth in a way that God's presence could not be found anywhere else. The temple in the Old Testament is literally called the house of God because that's exactly what it was. It was the dwelling place of God's presence here on earth. Now that's not the case for a church building. And sometimes Christians will call the church the house of God, but in reality it isn't. It doesn't contain the presence of God. It isn't the dwelling place of God, the church, whereas the temple in Jerusalem literally was. It was the house of God in the world, God's dwelling place on earth. And as you can imagine, as a result of that, it was of this immense importance to Jews. The most important place in the world was the temple found in Jerusalem. The most sacred place, the most holy place, the most special place in all of the world was the temple in Jerusalem. Because there, within its walls, there was this unique opportunity to meet with God in a way that you just couldn't do anywhere else in the world. You can imagine how special a place it must have been then to a Jewish believer, someone of the Jewish faith, to realize that the presence of God was uniquely dwelling in this building in the middle of Jerusalem. And as a result, Jews came from all over the place to get to Jerusalem and to get to the temple. because it was so important, because God's presence was dwelling there. God could be found there in the Temple of Jerusalem in a way that he couldn't be found in Nazareth or in Galilee or anywhere else in the world. And so Jews flocked to Jerusalem to encounter God and to meet with God in the temple in their capital city. We get back to the story from Mark chapter 11. And Mark chapter 11 is about Jesus' story, about Jesus, obviously, as we have been looking at over these last couple of weeks. And Jesus is a visitor to Jerusalem. He's not a native of Jerusalem. He's not from there. He was from further up in the north of Israel, from Nazareth, from Galilee. But like so many other Jews, he had travelled down to Jerusalem. And he had travelled many days. It was quite a distance from where Jesus was from to Jerusalem, to the temple. And so he had spent a bit of time, he had put a bit of effort in, and he had travelled days to get to Jerusalem, and he had travelled days to get to the temple. And when he got there, as he goes into the temple, Mark tells us this awesome story, this incredible story of what he finds there and how he reacts to it. Jesus, who has travelled down to Jerusalem many days to get to this wonderful city, to get to this wonderful temple, and Mark tells us what he finds there. When he goes into the temple, when he enters into this sacred, holy, special, different or unique building, he finds not so much the presence of God that is open to all or accessible to all who would come in, but he finds barriers put in the place of men and women, stopping them from getting to the presence and to have an encounter with God. So he finds in the temple in that day not the glory of the presence of God, which is open to everyone who would walk in through the entrance to that temple, but he finds barriers that have been put in the way of getting to God. And particularly in Mark's story of the cleansing of the temple, he finds that you have to have the right money, and so there are money changers there, and you have to have the right type of sacrifice, and so there are people who are selling doves there to be sacrificed to God. You have to have the right type of things to have an encounter with God. Barriers that are put up to the presence of God. And if you didn't have that correct type of money, then you couldn't enter. And if you didn't have the correct type of sacrifice, then you couldn't get into the presence of God. Barriers to getting into the presence of God, even in the temple. And what's more than that, what's worse than that, in the sight of Jesus as he enters the temple in Jerusalem, you even had people, and I don't suppose they were great rogues or great scoundrels, but what they had done is they had turned having the right money and having the right sacrifice into a money-making scheme. And so they're taking a bit of profit off the top. And so to change people's money into the right type of money, they would take a cut. And to give people doves that were able to be sacrificed to God, they would take a little bit of profit in that. And that's the scene Jesus sees as he goes into this holiest of places, this special, unique place where people could go to enter into the presence of God. And as we've read it this morning, as we've read the reaction of Jesus as he enters the temple, then it isn't an over-exaggeration to say that it outraged him. Now, Jesus doesn't react like that often in the Gospels. It outraged him to see the barriers in getting into the presence of God. It outraged him that people would turn getting into the presence of God into some kind of money-making or profit-making scheme. It outraged him. And that's the result of the story that we have read this morning. And as a Christian this morning, if you're watching this as a Christian too. It should serve as a warning to me and you not to fall into the trap of doing such a thing. We are not here, not called as Christians, as men and women who love the Lord and have put our faith and our trust in Him. We are not here to put up barriers that would prevent other people from knowing God. We're not here to use the promise of God's presence and God's goodness as a money-making scheme or to make a profit, and certainly not to swindle people out of money. To do that would be an awful thing, an outrageous thing, as it was in the eyes of Jesus all those years ago. It sounds a terrible thing, and you and I could say to each other this morning, well, I could never do that. In fact, I could never imagine a Christian doing that. And yet we have to be honest as Christians this morning as we look back at the history of our faith and of the church worldwide. There are countless examples of Christians doing exactly that, of putting up barriers between the world and God, of making people jump through all kinds of hoops before they can get into His presence, of doing things in a particular way, of dressing in a particular way, or of acting in a particular way, or of going to a certain place. And there have even been countless examples, sad examples, of Christians who have turned the presence of God into some kind of money-making scheme or profit-making scheme, almost selling the goodness and the love and the mercy and the grace and the presence of God on to people. And this story in Mark's Gospel would tell us that that's not on. It's not right. And here is a message that comes directly from Jesus, our Saviour. A message that comes directly from Jesus, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And it comes down to you and me this morning. That type of thing, he says, is not on. It's not acceptable. I haven't called you to put barriers up between me and the people that I love and the people that I've come for. And my grace and my mercy, it's not there to be bought and sold. In fact, the New Testament makes the opposite very, very and wonderfully clear this morning. The grace and the mercy and the love and the presence of God, they all come to us as a free gift. And it's important for me and you as a Christian this morning, or as Christians this morning, to realize that they are not ours to put a price on. In fact, Jesus said to his disciples in a passage in Matthew chapter 10, as he sends them out into the world and into their own communities, he gives them this instruction: heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out demons. And then he says this: freely you have received, so freely give. It was a command to them. It's a command to you and me too, as followers of Christ this morning, as we spread the good news and the love of God. That good news and that love has come to me completely free of charge, and freely I've received. And so it's my responsibility to freely give this morning. That's perhaps the first part of what I'd like to look at this, from this cleansing of the temple story. But I think there is a second part and a next type of meaning to it, and an equally important meaning to this cleansing of the temple as we read of it in Mark chapter 11, because I think the timing of this incident is all important. This is not just any week. It's not just any visit that Jesus makes to Jerusalem, and there were several over his life, and several times in his ministry he came down into Jerusalem for the feasts. But this isn't an ordinary week. It's not an ordinary visit. This is Holy Week. This is an incident that happens just after Palm Sunday. Jesus is making his way towards Calvary. And the cross and the death and the sacrifice of Jesus is all important in every story that happens in this Holy Week, as Jesus is building up to his sacrifice on the cross of Calvary. And so this is Holy Week, and it's important for us to read it in that context this morning to read it as the beginning of Holy Week. Jesus is in Jerusalem for a very specific reason and a very specific purpose. He is building up to his sacrifice on Calvary, and here in this Holy Week there is this great commotion in Jerusalem. There is this great controversy in Jerusalem. Jesus does this extraordinary thing. You know, to my mind, it's a message that he is sending to Jerusalem and that he is sending to you and me, that a new day is coming. A great and a glorious change is coming. And it's something that he wants Jerusalem to be stirred up about. And he wants people to talk about then. And he wants people to talk and know about it now. Here is Jesus at the beginning of Holy Week. And he is announcing to Jerusalem, and he is announcing to the world that the God who at this time can only be accessed in the temple, the God who can only be known behind a curtain, that God, says Jesus, is about to do something wonderful and is about to do something extraordinary. A new day is about to come. And here is Jesus stirring up the city and stirring up you and me as we read it this morning, to know and to understand that the God who could only be accessed in the temple, who could only be seen behind a curtain, is about to do something extraordinary. He is about to break out into the world. He is about to break into the lives and the hearts and the circumstances of ordinary men and women, not the special ones, but ordinary men and women, whosoever would have faith and trust in him. Now here is Jesus stirring up this great city of Jerusalem to understand that through the cross and through his sacrifice on the cross, God is now with us, not separated from us, not in the temple, not behind the curtain, not in the Holy of Holies, but God is with us through the sacrifice of his Son, with us wherever we are, with us whenever we are, and in whatever situation we are in, and whatever the circumstances that surround us. Now, the prophet Isaiah had promised this 800 years before these events in Jerusalem, when he talked about Jesus and talked about the coming of Jesus. And he says this, and they're famous words, and they're repeated in Matthew's Gospel, and you may well have heard them in Christmas services. But he says this: "Behold, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us." Now, and here is Jesus all these years later at the temple, and that prophecy of Isaiah is about to become a reality as he comes out of the temple on that day. And this great controversy and great commotion that happens in Jerusalem, it's about to become a reality. God is about to be with us. A God now not of a certain type of nationality or of heritage or of class or of background, but the God who is personally with us, whether we are in a crowd of thousands or whether we are in a crowd of hundreds, or whether we are completely on our own. In whatever circumstance we are going through, God is with us in his power, in his strength, in his might, and in his grace and love. Whether we are meeting in that lovely white chapel in the middle of Clydach Vale, or whether we are looking at a computer screen or a phone together as we are this morning, the God who is all-powerful and almighty and all-gracious and all loving, that God is personally with you and me this morning. Now, we talked about the circumstances that have robbed us of our attendance of a church building over these last couple of weeks. We can say, looking at this story, coronavirus and the pandemic that we are going through would have wrecked our relationship with God if His presence was only to be found in a certain building at a certain time. Wouldn't it be awful this morning if I'm here in Ystrad, but God was in Clydach, in the church, in the Bethel Bush, 3 or 4 miles away from me, not far, but not with me. And I couldn't get to Him because there's a pandemic happening. I couldn't get to Him because I can't open my church. We couldn't be encountering Him this morning because He is somewhere else different to you and me. This virus would have wrecked our relationship with God. It would have put it on hold for all these weeks that we have been locked down if His presence was only to be found in a certain building at a certain time. Yet we can be thankful this morning that through Jesus, nothing, not life, not death, not angels, not demons, not even a global pandemic can separate you and me from the love and the presence and the fellowship of an almighty and of an all-loving God. On that day, all those years ago, as Jesus, outraged at what he saw in the temple, chased out those money changers and chased out the sellers of wares out of that temple on that day in Jerusalem, he was announcing a glorious new day was about to dawn. God is about to become the sacrifice for our sins. God is about to become a permanent, living reality in the lives of those who would put their faith and trust in Him. This commotion that goes around Jerusalem on this day is this great big message coming from Jesus. God is with us. This is the love of God and the glory of what God would accomplish through the sacrifice of His Son on the cross of Calvary. Once the house of God was a temple in Jerusalem, but now the dwelling place of God is within those who would put their faith and their trust in Him. Now that's a huge statement, isn't it? That the house of God, the dwelling place of God, once used to be in the temple in Jerusalem, uniquely there and nowhere else. Yet now the dwelling place of God is within the hearts and the lives of ordinary people who would put their faith and their trust in Him. As Christians, this morning, we are not perfect. We are not always strong. We are not always right. We don't always know the correct thing to do or the right way to turn or the right things to say. But here is the reality of a relationship with Jesus, the presence and the reality of the God who created the heavens and the earth dwells within us through faith in Jesus. And you and me, and whoever this morning would put their faith in Christ, have become the house of God, the dwelling place of God, through Him who loves us and has given Himself for us. That's the end of our look this morning at Mark's Gospel for this week. As I said, my thanks to you for joining with me once again. I hope you have a lovely week ahead. The weather is not so good, is it, over these last couple of days, which is I usually have to shut my curtains to keep the sunlight out when I'm doing these things, but now I've got them wide open and the light on so you can all see my face. But I hope you have a lovely week until we meet again. continue to stay safe and continue to look after yourselves. The Lord bless you and keep you. And God willing, we'll meet again for our next installment next Sunday morning. Amen.